today's New York Jets training camp pads on. Joe Tippmann snapping balls erratically, seemed not to be able to find the shotgun snap correctly. Nick Faria, Athlon Sports, is my guest. Let's roll. Jets wide receiver, ESPN Jets reporter for The Athletic, Mr. Zach, and Jets legend, Mr. Marty Lyons.
Your host.
Welcome in, everyone. We are here. It is a Tuesday afternoon, Monday, actually. Monday afternoon camp practice was the first full practice with pads on. Joe Tippmann could not seem to find, today my guest is Nick Faria of Athlon Sports.
How you doing, Connor? Great to be on for the first time.
Yeah, really appreciate you having your first time on the show. So, Hassan Reddick, this holdout is really getting pricey for him when you think about it. I mean, every day he's getting fined. That today, since it was the $600,000. This, definitely it's not only hurting the Jets, but it's hurting Reddick as well. What do you take out of this? And their tweets getting put up by Justina Anderson saying talks are moving in a progressively moving, and then Rich Samini said he wouldn't be surprised if he saw him today at camp. Would you mark?
I would probably give it another week. I've talked about this before, and I could certainly be wrong. He could show up tomorrow. He could show up Wednesday. Reddick, he wants the kind of contract and the contract numbers that he has been clamoring for the last 5 years. Yeah. He hasn't been able to get it, so he's clearly upset. Obviously, he hasn't showed up to camp, but I think the Jets have the leverage now. Reddick essentially used up his leverage last week by not showing up, saying, okay, you guys traded away John Franklin, paid for that increase. And the Jets said, okay, that's fine, sit out of camp. But now Tack McKinley has looked really good. Will McDonald continues to impress. And the more those guys continue to produce, it's going to mitigate the amount of snaps that Reddick was initially expected to have going into this season. So this is a game of cat and mouse right now on the start of the regular season. He's going to be a free agent next year. As a guy that has recorded 10-plus sacks in each of the last 4 years, that productivity is his biggest play. He's going to miss out on millions of dollars next season.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. But here's the thing: you're an Eagles fan yourself. You've seen this. I mean, He's from Philly. He went to Temple University. Here's my thing. He was completely underpaid these past 2 seasons. He's surpassed double-digit sacks the past 4 seasons, recorded 16 in 2022, in which he finished, I think, 4th it was in Defensive Player of the Year voting that year. So if he knew he was going to get paid from Philly, and Ross Tucker said this, he was on with Will Parkinson the other day. He made a great point. He goes, he's from Philly, went to college Temple. If he knew he wasn't going to get paid, he would have stayed with Philly. And, the Jets apparently offered him an extension before they officially traded for him. He said he was going to be at OTA's minicamp. He's been losing money from all this. I definitely think we do see this holdout come to an end soon. Connor Hughes of SNY said it's going to look like somewhere from $25 to $28 million a year, which is between TJ Watt and Myles Garrett. Do you see that as a reasonable price range?
That's a reasonable price range, and quite frankly, it's what Hassan Reddick has been demanding for the past 4 years. And we got to remember something. I've been saying this a lot recently. Reddick, it's not just the last 4 years where he's been underpaid. He has been disrespected for ever since he got into the NFL. He was drafted by the Cardinals in the first round 6-7 years ago. He was out of position his first 3 years. Then they allowed him to be an edge rusher the final year of his deal with Arizona. He puts up 10 sacks. He goes into free agency. He doesn't get the offers he's looking for, so he signs a 1-year prove-it deal with the Carolina Panthers worth $6 million. He has more sacks than Brian Burns, but is still unable to get the long-term extension he's looking for. So he signs a 3-year deal with Philadelphia worth $45 million, about $15 million guaranteed per year. That's a significant increase than what he usually had. But the difference that we're looking at, of course, is when you have a player who is so disrespected time and time and time again, eventually that's going to fester with him. So he goes to a different team with the Jets, and they say to him, we'll let you play out the final year of your deal, or you agree to this extension, but you'll be playing a lot less snaps, so your efficiency is going to be even better for when you hit free agency in 2025. Well, then everything changed when John Franklin Myers got traded. So the leverage going back and forth, if the Jets didn't trade JFM, I think there's a very strong chance that Reddick is already in camp. He's already in OTAs, and he's not missing out on $300, actually close to $700,000 right now to this point. So ultimately, the leverage goes back and forth between Reddick and the Jets. This is going to be resolved, but this is a player that has been disrespected for a very long time. And Jet fans, I know football fans always like to side with the team they root for in these kind of contract negotiations. But remember, to say Hassan Reddick is overrated, I think is a gross overstatement. He's not overrated. He's one of the top 5, top 10 best edge rushers in the National Football League right now. No other edge rusher outside of Myles Garrett, who won Defensive Player of the Year last year, has had 10 or more sacks in each of the last 4 seasons. He's insanely clutch, arguably the most clutch edge rusher in the NFL today. And I can speak from that from experience. This guy makes plays when you absolutely need it.
Absolutely.
You can't complain about Reddick wanting his money when he's being paid the 20th most salary at his position, when he's clearly better than at least half of those players on that list.
Yeah, absolutely. And, these past 2 seasons, I think the amount of forced fumbles he's had is also incredible. I mean, I think he's led the league or came in second these past 2 years combined in forced fumbles. I believe he had 6 the past season. No, 2 years ago he had 6 forced fumbles. But, Nick, you've been at training camp these last few days. You've been able to, observe as a part of the media, see what's happening with the Jets. Who would you say right now, from what you've seen, is your dark horse, if you will?
It's got to be Takk McKinley. I obviously wasn't there today. I had to deal with a bunch of stuff with my apartment. But when I was there the last 3 days, overblown statement. The play was pretty much drawn dead because McKinley had gotten to the quarterback that quickly. He has been the Jets' surprise player on defense. I certainly think he's a player that can get plenty of snaps for the 2024 season, not just as a guy who is inactive on most Sundays. He's going to have a role on this team. And I think he's pushing out Michael Clemens because he's looked really good against the run as well. And if he produces against the run and the pass like he has, Michael Clemens, the Jets are keeping him around. They like him as that JFM replacement. But if you already have a guy in McKinley that's doing it, it's going to put a very difficult conversation into the coaching staff's meetings about whether McKinley or Clemens is going to be the guy to replace JFM.
Speaking against the run, the New York Jets signed Lakai Fotu to a deal this offseason from the Arizona Cardinals in hopes to replace Al Woods, who did retire this offseason. What have you seen from Fotu so far? Have you seen anything promising from Fotu?
I think he's an upgrade over Al Woods. I really do. Like what we've seen to this point is a guy that is dominant against the run, has even put forth a couple pressures, which was not Al Woods' strength throughout his career, as we all know. I look at Fotu right now as a player that's competing for number 1 team reps. I know they like Javon Kinlaw where he is with Quinnen Williams, and Kinlaw has looked great, no doubt about it. He's looked very solid. But the way Fotu's playing, this defensive tackle group is going to be a lot deeper than it was last season, particularly if this group is able to continue to play at this consistent level.
Yeah, now the defensive line is just one of the top really units on this team. I mean, they've looked great so far. They've been beating the offense so far through our training camp, which is some people have been concerned. Joe Tippmann, like I said, was erratic in terms of snapping the ball today. You going to the offensive side of the ball, Jets have had players like Malik Taylor, kind of skyrocket really at the last two practices with Xavier Gibson being out due to injury. Do you view him as a long shot in terms of cracking the 53?
Taylor?
Yeah.
Yes, I still do. Because when you look at the numbers right now, let's go through the list. You've got Garrett Wilson is a no-brainer. Alan Lazard is a no-brainer. Mike Williams is a no-brainer. Gibson, I think, is still a no-brainer, so that's 4.
Yes,
and then you have the question of Brownlee and Irv Charles. But Irv Charles is the special teams ace on this team. He was the replacement this past year. So you have him pretty much situated. So you've got 5 guys already on the roster at the receiver position. And now you're in a battle between Malik Taylor and Jason Brownlee for the 6th spot. Now, could the Jets keep 7 receivers? Yes, they certainly could. Is it likely with the needs along the offensive line and the depth of the offensive line, you could potentially be seeing 4 running backs make the final roster as well, 3 quarterbacks make the final roster? Ultimately, the numbers don't add up. So I think it's certainly possible that the Jets stick with 6 wide receivers to this point right now and go with 10 offensive linemen. Because, again, it's not that Taylor's been bad. It's just that there aren't enough spots. And I think it would be a mistake if the Jets went with a 7th receiver over a 10th offensive lineman.
Yeah, absolutely. And these reps include for Taylor are just it's only helping. I mean, how he's been capitalizing so far on these opportunities with Gibson out. But Ryder and Taylor Talons, wants to know who has Tack been going up against.
Yeah, so he's been going up against the second team offensive line, and that's where I think context has to be included. He hasn't been going up against Tippmann, hasn't been going up against AVT or John Simpson. But I will say, just because he dominates the likes of Carter Warren and DeCoulis doesn't mean that he's not a good player. And I think once you get him acclimated to the first team, I think he can be a dependable player. The fact that he's dominating this much against the second team offensive line, I think, is what is telling of how good a player he can be in this Jets defense. The Jets have taken reclamation projects and made them into consistent players on this defense. I've always said, if there's one thing Jet fans can't question about Robert Saleh and his coaching staff, it's making sure that they can develop defensive players. They've done a great job with that. So in my opinion, McKinley, yes, he's only going up against the 2s right now, but he's certainly capable of competing against the 1s as long as he plays at this high level.
Yeah, and competing at this high level, I mean, this is what was expected out of Takk McKinley. I mean, he was a first-round draft choice people are forgetting about. So it's like, if he actually starts to have success, fans shouldn't be completely surprised. I mean, because this is what was expected. You know what it kind of reminds me of? It kind of reminds me of the Solomon Thomas situation.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at a guy like him, he was supposed to be way better than he is. I mean, 3rd overall pick. I mean, there are high expectations. Takes him a little to set in, and then he kind of develops into an average player. But if you told me Solomon Thomas was a 3rd or 4th round pick, I'd be like, oh my God, this guy's a steal. So, a lot of it really depends on draft position. But that's kind of what it reminds me of. These guys are not first-round draft choices. I'm talking about the undrafted free agents here. You have Leonard Taylor, you have Eric Watts, you have Braden McGregor. Looking at those guys, Brady McGregor, I believe, had a sack today. Eric Watts looked great throughout spring workouts and OTAs. What you've been able to observe out of those guys, who do you think has the best shot of making the 53-man roster? And also, not to note that all 3 were selected in a UFL draft, which was very interesting. Who do you think? But out of those 3 guys, who do you think have the best chance of cracking the 53?
It's probably McGregor right now. And I will say, it's difficult to predict because there's a very good chance none of them make the 53-man roster. Because if you look at where the Jets, we talked about it before with the receivers, go through the list of defensive linemen and the edge rushers. You've got JJ, Jermaine Johnson, Will McDonald, Michael Clemens, Hassan Reddick, Takk McKinley. That's already 5 on the roster. Now, they could keep 6, not saying they won't, but let's say they have that 6-man, available. The competition between Taylor and McGregor and Watts, as of right now, I know Watts has looked solid overall. McGregor's put up a lot of great numbers in practice, and the fact that he was able to produce in pads today, I think, is going to help him out in the long run. So there's no guarantee that any of these guys make it, but if I were a betting man right now, I think the favorite would be McGregor.
So now you mentioned you kind of counted those guys up before you really took into consideration. You consider Clemens a lock for the 53? I know some people do, but there's also some who are a little skeptical about him cracking the 53.
The Jets are a team, and I kind of find it a little odd because Howie Roseman does this a lot with his players. He will always, if it comes down to a final roster spot, he will keep the player he drafted over a UDFA or a free agent, whatever that is. He will always try to keep the homegrown talent. And because Joe Douglas was at the altar of Roseman at one point in his career, I would think that they would do the same. That hasn't always been the case, though. Israel Abanikanda, I think, is going to be out the door eventually in camp because eventually you're just running out of snaps for him to play. So I look at this right now where things stand. I think Clemens is safe because of his draft status, but if he doesn't produce, certainly that conversation can change.
You mentioned Izzy Abanikanda being out of the picture. I've completely agreed with you since the day the Jets, they drafted the 2 running backs, and then not to mention they also signed Tariq Cohen, who hasn't appeared in an NFL game since 2021. So that definitely sent a message to Abanikanda. But someone who, is even further behind Abanikanda, which is even harder to believe, is Nick Bawden. I mean, he was placed on the PUP list, physically unable to perform, and this is only hurting him as the days go on. I mean, the chances of him making the roster are just dwindling now. So, I like we said, you've been at almost every single practice except today's practice. What are some really, we spoke about Dark Horse, Talk McKinley earlier. What are some things you've been observing that you find really interesting?
Well, we have to talk about Tippmann, right? He had a bad practice today from all accounts, had some bad snaps. But I'm going to caution Jet fans who are starting to worry. I've seen some people talk about Connor McGovern, bringing him back, bringing that leadership. I will always push back against that, and I will give a legitimate reason why. When you look at the best center of the last decade, who's on that list, Connor? You have to think Jason Kelsey's on that list, right?
Of course, yes.
Right. All-Pro, 6-time All-Pro, all that stuff. Tippmann isn't Kelsey. But what we forget about Kelsey is he was on the roster bubble after the 2016 season. He was not having a good run in 2015 or 2016. It was the 2017 season that really saw him emerge as an all-pro player, and that was 6 years in the NFL. Nick Mangold took, 2-3 years for him to develop into the all-pro.
He kind of came in right away, yeah.
He came in right away, but he struggled his first year. He kind of struggled in his second year, too. It wasn't just the immediate results that people look for. So that patience needs to be given. And yes, the snaps got to be lower. He knows that. He's got to be better. I remember seeing an interview with Jason Kelsey one time on the New Heights podcast, and he goes, I snap the ball fast because I need my hand back. So essentially what's happening is Reddick is learning everything. He's learning the checks. He's learning the calls. He is trying to be the Jason Kelsey of this Jets offensive line, the lead communicator, the leader, making sure everyone's locked in and loaded for any blitz packages or twists and stunts that are going on. As a young player, that can kind of overburden you. So he is learning on the fly of reading the defense and then getting the ball out as quick as he can. Is it concerning right now? I'm here to tell you it's not, because he's going to figure this out. He was able to snap the ball last season without any issues. The difference is he is snapping to Aaron Rodgers now as opposed to Zach Wilson. So there is a learning experience here that needs to happen. I'm not really worried about Tippmann. I know the snap issue has happened many times throughout training camp to this point, but we're still in July. It's July 29th. The season doesn't start until September. He's got a full month to figure it out, and I'm more than confident that he will.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's better to see these mistakes happen from Tippmann. I've seen it on Twitter too, very early, like right now, then we see this issue kind of progress through, as we get closer to preseason and training camp, more in training camp, preseason and the regular season. It's like you said, the standard is completely different when you talk about snapping to Aaron Rodgers versus Zach Wilson. But I want want to move over the defensive side of the ball. Chuck Clark had an interception today, but it wasn't, it wasn't Rodgers' fault that he threw the interception. It kind of came off Lazard's hands right into Chuck Clark, who ended up intercepting the ball. There's, Jet safety room, I think, is an area of concern going into 2024, given the fact that we have Tony Adams, who I think will be great. I have his jersey on right now.
Well done.
Thank you. We have Chuck Clark, who thing I'm concerned about is, will he be able to return to, a starting quality level safety after missing a full year on an ACL tear? Will he be reliable enough to really take that job? And then you have Ashton Davis, JBC, those guys. I think it's mostly right now between Tony Adams and Clark. What you've seen so far, who do you think comes away with that starting job?
It sounds like, and from what I've seen, it's going to be Adams and Clark as a starting safety with Davis as the third guy. And I will say, regarding Clark, we got to remember when he was traded to the Jets last offseason, it was seen as a steal because they only had to give up like a 7th-round pick for him. And he is a starting caliber safety. He's a really good safety. He's able to play in the box, play in coverage. His coverage grade is really good. His in the box play is really good. This is a quality safety that I think could be a Pro Bowl caliber player if he's in the right defense. And with Baltimore, last year's Baltimore Ravens defense was elite. It hasn't really been the case, though, since Lamar Jackson became quarterback. There were some issues structurally on that Ravens defense over the last few years. So I think Clark is in a perfect situation. I think he's going to bounce back really well. And the Jets love Tony Adams. They absolutely love him. His development has been really solid. He had a good year last year. I wouldn't call it great, but he had a very good year as a starter for the first time. So this safety room, yes, it's probably the weakest of any position on the Jets defense and maybe even the Jets' entire roster. But you're comparing a position of low value to other positions where the Jets have 1 or 2 all-pro caliber players. I think they're going to be fine no matter what this season because Clark, to me, is an upgrade over Jordan Whitehead. And I think that's really all that matters.
Yeah, Jordan Whitehead, I think, might be one of the worst tacklers I've ever seen play football. I mean, he had that, interception-wise, he had that 3-interception game against Josh Allen. But, I mean, those balls are kind of coming right at him compared to the tackling. Like, he missed tackles like crazy. So, I agree. It's completely an upgrade. But, speaking of, battles, this one's for the number 2 spot on the depth chart. You have Breece Hall solidified number 1. Braylon Allen's kind of leading the way there, number 2. You see him getting the nod over Davis?
Yeah, I think this is a foregone conclusion now, especially after today's practice. Apparently, he bulldozed over a player. He's been great in pass protection. He's a great receiver as well. I think this battle, you never see position battles end very quickly unless a player is just dominant. I remember in 2021, the Eagles were having a position battle between Andre Dillard and Jordan Mailata. And Mailata was so much better than Dillard in camp. By the 3rd practice, they had anointed him as the starting left tackle because there was no reason to continue the battle further. I think we're getting to that point with Braylon Allen. It's not that Isaiah Davis has been bad. He's been really good as well as the 3rd running back. It's not as the number 2 guy. So I think this battle's over. Braylon Allen has been fantastic. And I'm going to say if the Jets were looking for an Aaron Jones, A.J. Dillon duo, kind of like what the Packers had with Rodgers, Breece Hall and Braylon Allen could certainly be that.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I really appreciate you joining me. One more thing before your final thoughts. Started this question 2 shows ago. Jeremy Fowler of ESPN. Yesterday when I had Saturday actually, when I had Brandon Pockris on, I asked him this question. Before you get to your final thoughts, anyone, 4 dinner guests, dead or alive, anyone who stepped foot on the earth, who are they?
Okay, all right. For anyone on earth.
And anyone dead or alive, anyone.
Give me George Washington. George Washington. Oh, wow. Big one. R.I.P. George. I would have to say Lincoln as well. Both of them. I think you're looking at the 2 best presidents.
The presidents, wow.
And then I'm going to go completely in a different direction. Chuck Bednarik, arguably one of the greatest linebackers of all time. You're asking an Eagles fan this question, so you're getting Eagle answers. Chuck Bednarik, the greatest Eagle of all time, and then Donovan McNabb. He's still alive. However, he is my hero just as much as Connor. Who's your favorite quarterback that you've seen growing up?
Well, I haven't seen great quarterbacks growing up, especially
Give me your best player. I feel bad. Give me your best player that you've seen growing up.
Honestly, it's probably like Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner. Those are probably the two best players.
You having dinner with Sauce? I'm having dinner with McNabb. That's the guy that when I was 6 years old and I was playing Pop Warner in Rhode Island with a bunch of Patriot fans that I just couldn't stand. I was becoming an Eagles fan. And I said, you know what? McNabb's my favorite player. Screw you, screw you, screw you. So yeah, it has to be McNabb, but Narek can give me the two presidents.
Absolutely, Nick. I really appreciate you joining me. Now, time for your final thoughts.
All right, final thoughts. Look, I'll say this. Everyone wants to have a reaction to training camp. I think everyone needs to relax. Everyone just needs to take a deep breath and relax. No season is won at this time. Seasons are lost due to injuries, but no season is won on July 29th when an offensive group struggles, a defensive group struggles. Last week, people were worried about the defensive line and how quiet they were. Now it's, well, what about Joe Tippett? His snaps have been bad. What are we going to do? Breathe. I've called Jet fans the most bipolar fan base on the planet. I've called the Eagles the most pathologically negative fan base on the planet. Everyone's got their little tics and nervous issues. Jet fans are going to be fine. The team looks elite. The defense looks elite. And the offense looks light years better than they were last season. I think this is going to be a special season.
Everyone smash that like button. Make sure you're subscribed, Nick. Like I said, really appreciate you joining me. Everyone, thank you guys for watching. And as always, JETS, 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 Jets.